The old Slave Mart was one of many Charleston locations where slaves were auctioned off to new owners. After an 1808 ordinance prohibiting the United States from participating in the international slave trade, Southern whites began to trade amongst one another. Before the old Slave Mart was created, slaves were sold at the downtown exchange building until the practice of public slave auctions was banned in 1856. People created these marts in order to continue selling slaves in private. Located on 6 Chalmers Street, one of the only streets in the city that still has cobblestone, the old Slave Mart, then called Ryan's Mart, was constructed in 1859 by Thomas Ryan. The building was once an alley next to the German Volunteer Fire Department, which is now a law office. The area behind the mart housed the jail, kitchen, and morgue. Those buildings no longer exist and now make up a parking lot leading out to Queen Street. When the Slave Mart eventually closed in 1865, all the slaves still in Ryan's Mart were freed. The building was then used as an auto repair shop and a tenement for the free blacks. Today, the old Slave Mart is a museum that acts to interpret the history of the city's slave trade. The building is one of the last slave auction galleries in South Carolina and sold slaves to plantations across the South and city homes in the Charleston area.
Charleston was the epicenter for the importation of enslaved Africans in the 18th century. Even though most of these people would go on to work on plantations across the South, some stayed in Charleston. These slaves were known as urban slaves. Even though they only made up about 10% of the total slave population, their presence was very important to city life. Most of the enslaved people in Charleston were domestic servants, meaning they worked as maids, washers, cooks, and the like in their owner's house. Others were skilled laborers like brick masons, carpenters, coopers, and blacksmiths. Urban slaves were often hired out either by their owners or of their own accord, completely disregarding South Carolina's laws forbidding slaves to hire themselves out. When slaves were hired out, they usually lived away from their owner. Mostly, these slaves lived with the person they were hired out to. Sometimes they were allowed to rent a home while in the city. Domestic slaves, for the most part, lived in the same house as their master, meaning they were on call 24/7. In large urban complexes, slaves usually lived in separate slave quarters. At the Aiken-Rhett House, one of these large urban complexes, slaves lived in dormitory-style housing located above the kitchen and stables. South Carolina law stated that kitchens had to be separate from houses to decrease the risk of fire, but slaves lived there, as concern for their safety and well-being was not paramount to concern for the white family's safety. Even so, urban slaves were far better off than plantation slaves. Frederick Douglass wrote in his narrative,
"A city slave is almost a free man compared with the slave on the plantation. He is much better fed and clothed and enjoys privileges altogether unknown to the slave on the plantation."
These privileges included adequate housing, more personal freedoms pertaining to religion, better food and clothing, and opportunities to work for pay. They were sometimes taught how to read and write as well. These privileges led to a more knowledgeable and expansive worldview than that of a slave on an isolated plantation. Urban slaves often came into contact with free blacks, which further expanded their worldview and gave them a knowledge of the freedoms afforded to free blacks in the South and in the North.
This gate at the Aiken-Rhett House represented the barrier between urban slavery and free blacks in Charleston. Outside this gate, enslaved and free African Americans intermingled in the marketplace and ports. Sometimes slaves would sell their own products from their personal gardens or from the clothes they made in the marketplace to free blacks and white people alike. Enslaved and free blacks would also congregate together in churches in Charleston. Because of these ties, many free blacks formed strong bonds with the slave community because of their similar socioeconomic status. Barriers such as the gate at the Aiken-Rhett House existed in Charleston because the white elites knew the danger free blacks posed to the system order of slavery. Freedmen represented a confusing social class in the slave system and were an example of what slaves sought desperately to achieve. Even while a majority of freedmen in Charleston lived in poverty barely distinguishable from slaves, they are free to practice their own skills, to earn their own living, and to earn their own wages. Free slaves held occupations such as carpenters, blacksmiths, tailors, shoemakers, weavers, and barbers, just to name a few. Skilled freemen were a threat to similarly skilled whites, and the competition increased hostility between the two races. Race hostility became so tense that free blacks were forced to wear badges in Charleston from 1783 to 1789. This badge, found by Harlan Green at a Cooper River plantation site in 2012, is an extremely rare example of such badges. Freedmen were required to wear badges such as this in that 6-year period to distinguish themselves and protect themselves from accusations of being runaway slaves. Some research suggests that there were more years and more time periods that slaves and freedmen alike had to wear badges similar to this. Denmark Vesey was an example of a free African American who combated the social and racial divide in Charleston.
No one completely knows when or where Denmark Vesey was born. Mainstream researchers believe that Vesey was born around 1767 in either Africa or on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas. Denmark Vesey gained his freedom unusually in 1799 when he won the lottery and was able to buy his freedom. The home that Denmark Vesey supposedly rented out is located at 20 Bull Street in Charleston. However, archival and architectural evidence suggests that the house at 20 Bull Street may not even be the home Vesey rented. Despite the existence of evidence that Vesey did not actually occupy the dwelling, it still stands as a symbol of the man who had the courage and audacity to orchestrate one of the most elaborate and unsuccessful slave insurrections in the United States. The resourcefulness that would be key in organizing the rebellion was first documented on Saint-Domingue, where as a slave on a sugar plantation, he faked seizures to be released from the backbreaking labor in the fields. In 1783, Captain Joseph Vesey decided to give up his position on a slaver and moved to Charleston, South Carolina. With the freedom he gained in the lottery, Denmark Vesey was able to open up his own carpentry shop. In 1817, Vesey joined the newly formed African Methodist Episcopal Church, where he became a preacher to a small group in his home during the week. Possibly seeing this as a way of expressing some form of self-determination, white Charlestonians constantly monitored services and even arrested members. Angry by this encroachment upon their freedoms, Vesey began emphasizing the Old Testament story of the Israelites, Exodus from Egypt, and drawing parallels to the plight of the African Americans in Charleston. In 1822, Vesey and other leaders began plotting a rebellion. His chief lieutenant was an East African priest named Gullah Jack, who led conspirators in prayer and rituals and gave them amulets to protect them in battle. The use of Gullah Jack shows how some slaves were reluctant to follow the Christian ideals of Vesey and felt more comfortable incorporating their own African ideals with Christianity. Vesey eventually set the date for the revolt on July 14th, and men from Charleston and surrounding plantations planned to seize Charleston's arsenals and guardhouses, kill the governor, set fire to the city, and kill every white man they saw. But in June, several nervous slaves leaked the plot to their masters, and Charleston authorities began arresting leaders. Vesey was captured on June 22nd, and he and the conspirators were brought to trial. Despite torture and the threat of execution, the men refused to give up their followers. On July 2nd, Denmark Vesey and 5 other men were hanged. Gullah Jack was executed several days later, with the total number of executions reaching 35 by August 9th. In the aftermath of the Vesey Rebellion, the African church was burned down and authorities passed a series of laws further restricting the rights of Charleston blacks. During the Civil War, when black soldiers were finally able to join the Union Army, all black regiments like the 54th Massachusetts used his name as a battle cry, signifying that his memory had survived despite all white attempts to bury the actions of him and his followers. Today, Denmark Vesey stands as a testament to the power of bravery and faith. With these two things, he planned to overthrow the oppressive system that had overpowered him and was continuing to do the same to his people. Although he did not succeed, and it would be decades before freedom came to African Americans, his deeds would be instrumental in the abolition of slavery.